this fascinating study that the average person spends 4 hours per day on the equivalent of like mental autopilot. This isn't when you're sleeping, which is the equivalent of a decade of their lifetime. That for most of us, and our brains are wired to conserve energy. They don't like to do a lot of work. And so most of our life, we're just kind of going through it. And as I thought about this, at first it was a concerning idea that for so much of our life, it's unconscious, a decade of our lifetime. But the thing is, it is kind of just a fact of life that we will not always be fully present to what we're doing, and there are things that just have to get done. But the power of ritual is that rituals help us design our default. You see, if we're going to live on default, it is not necessarily a bad thing. It only depends on where our default is leading us. Can we design our default to go in the direction we want to go? I think of life like this a lot of times. It is as though we are going on a hike at high altitude. And for most of our days, we are in the midst of the cloud layer. We can't see far in front of us. All you can see is the deadline you have coming up this week, the kids' soccer practice this weekend, the test you have at the end of the week, the project you have to turn in at work. You only can see a couple steps in front of you, and you don't have the long view. We're just on that default, one foot in front of the other. But occasionally, we have those moments where we get just above the cloud layer. We can stop for a moment and see where it is that we're going. And that is what our seasonal rituals, which we're going to be talking about today, offer us. Whether that's your yearly vacation, when you go to the beach, and for just that moment, I know for me, I go to Aztec Island every year, and when I get to unplug and I come over that bridge and pull down the windows and can just smell the salt air, I have the opportunity to get above the clouds and think, man, another year. Where are we going here? Where am I going to point that signpost? What do I want to grasp towards? Or maybe it's at the holidays when we have the busyness of life for a moment, slow down. I get to just stop and reflect. And as we look at the horizon above the clouds, we get to decide which direction am I going to go in before we trudge back down through the midst, putting just one foot in front of the other. Well, if you're new to this series, we've been talking about rituals for the past 3 weeks. And what we've said is that rituals solidify our disciplines and they bring meaning to the mundane. On that first point, it's the idea of we have those things that we do repeatedly, which you can go to the next slide to show this. So we have our habits, which are just anything we do repeatedly. It could be tying your shoes. But then we have our disciplines, the things we do repeatedly for the purpose of life change. But then our rituals are that layer on top that we put there to give form and structure to the things we do repeatedly to help solidify that discipline and bring meaning to the mundane. Just like Arnold Zadekow was doing in that camp there, of taking the ritual of lighting the Hanukkah candles to take what was not just mundane, but was inhumane, and bring meaning to it and grasp on to hope. We've also looked at the 3 elements of ritual, that in a ritual, to what separates an empty ritual from a deep ritual are these 3 elements: attention, being present to what you are doing; intention, deciding why you are doing this; and repetition. We've used this image of a garden hose, of the repetition being the continuous flow of the water, the attention being putting your thumb over that hose, and the power of that it speeds the flow through focus. Then intention is the guiding of that. Where is it that we want it to go? And to dive into this, to explore this idea of those mountaintop moments, of those seasonal rituals, we are going to go, of all places, and buckle up, we're going to the book of Leviticus. And what I love, so many of us, we are so new to church, that doesn't even make you anxious right now, which is awesome. For those of you that grew up in church, you're wondering where the nearest exit is, and bear with me, we're going to have some fun with it. But Jacob Milgram, the same guy who I quoted earlier, he says this about Leviticus in his introduction to his commentary on it. He says, values are what Leviticus is all about. They pervade every chapter and almost every verse. Many may be surprised to read this, since the dominant view of Leviticus is that it consists only of rituals such as sacrifices and impurities. This too is true. Leviticus does discuss rituals. However, underlying the rituals, the careful reader will find an intricate web of values that purports to model how we should relate to God and to one another. And so if you're not familiar, in the first 5 books of the Bible, we have what's called the Pentateuch. penta for 5 in Greek. And what we have there is it's really one book extended over 5 kind of divisions there. And it starts in the garden, and humanity has experienced this intimacy with God in Eden, the way they were meant to live. But then they are separated from this communion with God, and they go through slavery in Egypt, the exact opposite of Eden. And then the journey is to try to find, how can we have that communion with God again? How can we find that Eden? In Leviticus, in all of its strange, weird complexity, like we're allowed to say the Bible gets weird at points, and Leviticus is the height of its weirdness, it is trying to show how can we get back to that idea of intimacy with God. And specifically, we're going to be diving into one of the answers to that question, which is the Israelite calendar, those moments that were set into the rhythm of their life to get above the clouds, to look where they are going, to remember where they came from, how to live in the present, and what they should hope for in the future. Michael Lefebvre, in his fascinating book on the Israelite calendar, writes this: the cadences set by Israel's 7 worship festivals, particularly its 3 pilgrimage festivals, provided a national metronome, that they were to set the pace of their life so that they could then calm down after the quarter notes and the quarter notes and the quarter notes. They could hit a whole note, pause, get above the fray, and set their intentions for where they were to go. There's 7 of the festivals. We're not going to get into all of them. We're just going to do a high-level look at how we can take this idea of those moments in time where we get into the place where we can rest and see beyond the day-to-day grind, and how we might use those for transformation modeled off of this. And so in Leviticus 23, it starts with the Lord speaking to Moses, and it says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. They are my appointed feasts." Now, just to have like a little bit of fun, we talked last week about the Sabbath, and we talked about how it's the first thing in Scripture called holy. Well, there's a really fun thing that happens here of right after this, there's a verse that completely breaks the flow of the chapter. It's like, okay, here are my appointed feasts, and then what comes right after it is the Sabbath, which doesn't seem to make sense, but we remember that Sabbath, first thing called holy, and he's showing here something really important. By following the feasts, by breaking up, before we even get to the feast, this idea of Sabbath, it's this idea that your daily life spills into your seasonal highs. You see, before he can even get to the festivals, he's like, let's remember the cadence we've already set to the metronome, that cadence of work and rest. And for so many of us, maybe you've experienced this, that you had this intention of, I'm going to go away on vacation, and it's going to be amazing. I work too hard, I'm too busy, I'm too stressed, I'm overworked, I can't rest. I'm going to go on vacation, it's going to be awesome. And then the metronome you've already set for your life is such that when you get on vacation, the whole time you're checking your work emails, it flies by. You can't actually rest because how you live your daily life will spill into those seasonal highs, which is why it starts with that rhythm of Sabbath, where have you baked into your life already this practice of rest? Because if you can't rest in the micro, trying to do it on the macro is not going to work. But we'll keep going. So as though that verse never even happened, it jumps back. These are the appointed feasts, the holy convocations, and there's a couple in the spring, a couple in the fall. Like I said, we're just going to kind of do a high-level look. The first one we find is the Passover, which in week 1 of this series, when we introduced this concept of ritual, we talked about the fact that they reoriented the calendar after the Passover so that it would start with this idea of liberation. The very thing that would begin your year is the remembrance of what God had done in the past, that while they were slaves, God liberated them, and that is where we are going to start. But then the second festival is the unleavened bread, which is the reminder of the manna as they were going from Egypt towards the promised land. The point being that our seasonal rituals remind us where we came from. You see, just like they were in the camp, and they were longing for that taste of home, what they're doing in these first 2 rituals is reminding them of where they came from, even if it wasn't their own experience, which is really fascinating to me because it's something we see played out in our own lives. For so many of us, we still celebrate the rituals and festivals of a culture that was maybe our parents, grandparents, or something far before us that we never even had, but we feel this connection to when we celebrate that ritual. Or for so many people, you still celebrate religious rituals even after you're not religious because it just wouldn't be the same if you didn't have that ritual in your life. I remember when I went to college, and it was my first Christmas away from home. And if you know anything about the Suggs family, you know that we love Christmas. Eliza and I shamelessly watched a Christmas movie last night. November 1st is like 2 days away, and our house will be fully decorated on the 1st. No objections. And so I remember sitting in my college dorm room and feeling like something wasn't right. Every year, it's such a big production and decorating the house. And as I sat in my shoebox of a dorm room that looked like all the other dorm rooms, it just didn't feel like Christmas. And what was missing was that ritual of decorating. So I remember going out, putting on my jacket to brave the Chicago winter, and on my shoestring budget, going to the CVS to just get a couple decorations. They wouldn't bring me home. But in just putting up a few things in my room, it reminded me of the home I longed for. And for so many of us, our rituals, they might not even point you back to the home you had, but the home you always wished for. That place where you felt safe and secure. That place that allows you to remember the beauty of life in the little things, which is what I think we see in those first two festivals. But we'll go on. Later in the spring, in the festival of Pentecost, or the festival of weeks, Pentecost just being 50 days after Passover, you have a harvest festival. And in the midst of all of this chaos of bringing as much food as you can and just partying, there's a really interesting line here. It says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God." You see, what we saw in the first is that rituals point us back to where we came from. What we see in this one is seasonal rituals reminding us how to live in the present. In the midst of their feasting, God calls them to remember those who are fasting, not for religious reasons, but because they simply don't have enough. You know, there's only so many moments, like I said, when we have that opportunity to stop and ask, which direction are we going in life? And what he's baking into this ritual is, in this moment of pausing, can you remember to set that direction towards generosity? Because their experience of being sustenance farmers would not have been one of abundance. It would have been one of, can I make enough to feed my family this year, or will I have to sell one of my children into slavery? But what he's calling them is, in this moment, in the rare moment where you can think beyond just the mere survival, when you can look at the abundance I have provided, can you build generosity into that? So when you get back into the clouds and you can't see beyond the next week, can you make sure that your footsteps are going in the direction you want to go? When you have that moment to pause, can you direct it where you want to go? The idea here being that seasonal rituals are designed to remind us how to live in the present. You know, when I go back to my college experience, when I think about the interplay of seasonal rituals, of these momentary highs and how they direct our lives, I remember the ritual that we had of open hall. And colleges, just as an aside, are full of rituals. And why? Because they know that they will shape who we are. Those songs you sing, the games you go to, it makes it the difference of, I went to Clemson and I am a Clemson Tiger alumni, right? Because the rituals are powerful. And Bible college, which I went to, is a whole microcosm of its own. It's a weird place, and it's a whole conversation for another day. But you'd start the year with this thing called open hall. And all of the guys' floors, it was like 18 stories in a high-rise in Chicago, would have theirs, and the girls' floors would have a different one. Again, Bible college, weird place, right? But in the guys' open hall, each floor had a mascot. You could be the pandas. You could be, there was, I think, like the monks. There were the crows. There were the pigs. Like, you'd all dress up as your mascot, and you get into these strange rituals, right? And with people you met like a week ago, but you were all in. And ours was the gentleman. And so we would get dressed up, and we would wear suits and ties, and we would process in like silently and just kind of stand there, right? I guess that's what gentlemen do. But what was really fascinating was that every year, right after this experience of kind of going in there, we'd come out, we would get into our kind of lounge on the floor, and we would read from this scroll that people years before us had written, people we didn't know but we felt connected to through the ritual, that they had written on with actual like feather quill in cursive, the Gentleman's Creed. And it was all these statements of what it meant to be a gentleman. It talked about how we would treat our sister floor, how we would treat the brothers on the floor, how we'd hold one another accountable, how we would show up to our classes, how we would be people of integrity. And as crazy as this whole ritual sounded, I remember coming away from that every year wanting to be more of a gentleman. As you sat there and all committed to this thing in your suits, which barely fit for most of them because you're college students and you're broke and you don't wear suits, there was something in this ritual, in this moment of pausing, that allowed us to say, this is where we want to go in this school year. Before the craziness of the schedule came, before all of the deadlines and the due dates and the papers, I had this opportunity to say, this is where we are going. Let us design our default that we might go in the direction we want to go. There's one last festival that I want to look at. Now we are in the fall. We're in kind of a grouping of those fall festivals where you might be familiar from the school calendar of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur when your kids get off, et cetera, et cetera. There is this story, or this command, which is just fascinating. We talked earlier about this movement in the first 5 books of the Bible, from that experience of communion with God, of Eden, of intimacy, then moving away from that and longing for it again. And they pick up on it here. It says, on the first day, pick the best fruit from the best trees, take fronds of palm trees and branches of leafy trees, and from willows by the brook, and celebrate in the presence of your God for 7 days. Yes, 7 full days. Celebrate it as a festival to God. And what they're doing here is, when the Israelites would have heard this, they're thinking back to that experience of Eden that had been lost, that thing that they desire for so intimately, and they're playing off of it in such a fun way here. Pick the best fruit. What do we find in the Garden of Eden? From the best tree, but the tree of life. And how is it described in the book of Genesis? It's by a river, and what do we have here? By the brook. By going through the motions of this ritual, what they were being taught to do was to desire the thing that they were created for, to long for that intimacy with God that had been lost in the garden, in the very way that the ritual is created, to go back, and though it had been lost, to yearn for that thing that they wanted most. You see, our seasonal rituals at their best point to our deepest desires for the future. You know, so many of us, I think we miss the idea of seasonal rituals being just a signpost, but we hope that in the one day of Thanksgiving, that it will not just teach us to desire, not just show us the horizon of what a family looks like, but somehow in the magic of one day, we'll have that perfect family. Or in Christmas, that magic will return to our lives in the one day, or at New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, when we set those intentions for the year to come. It's not just that those are things we're going to carry out through the year, but that it would happen in that day, and yet we're somehow left wondering, why do these holidays, why do these vacations, that this taste of rest, why does it not deliver on what it is? But they're not supposed to deliver it in that day. Going and picking that fruit on the tree by the river, it didn't bring them back to Eden. Celebrating Hanukkah in the camp, it didn't make the camp go away. Getting your family to hold hands at Thanksgiving, it's not going to take away the arguments and the disagreements and the bad blood that has occurred over years. But what it can do is teach us to desire the right things. That in that moment of getting away from the craziness, of being together, that we might say, this is where we're going. In that moment of that Christmas, when you're all together, I think back to my experience of every year at Christmas, we watch Elf as we're opening presents, and then when it gets to the moment where they sing the song, we all actually sing it. And it feels so weird, right? But for a moment, you feel like a kid again. For a moment, it feels like there is just magic in the air, and that moment leaves. And if we counted on that moment to actually change everything, we would be vastly disappointed. But what it does is it serves as that signpost of pointing us to something that we desire and shows us which way to keep walking in. And that is the opportunity that we have. But on this idea of the deepest desires, more than just the magic of childhood, more than just the idea of having a family or having abundance, what these rituals were meant to do that we found in Leviticus was to show them that they could once again be close with God. That in the midst of the chaos of the everyday life, that in the midst of the experience of feeling far from God, that they could just get a taste of that intimacy. And C.S. Lewis has this wonderful quote: of if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. And that is exactly what they were meant to do, was to show us that there is something more, to let us glimpse the transcendent. And even if that sounds crazy to you, I think all of us can walk away from this looking at our seasonal rituals a bit differently. And so my challenge to you, our last micro practice of the series, is to just take an inventory of your seasonal rituals, whether that's your yearly vacation, whether that's your Thanksgiving, your Christmas, whatever it may be, and ask, how can you design these to reorient yourself in the direction you want to go? Because I know that we don't have that many moments where we actually get away and think beyond our day-to-day. And so what will that mean perhaps at Thanksgiving? What would that look like to take that and say, how can I make this not just to do, but a ritual that's going to lead us toward where we want to go? Or maybe that's Christmas for you. Maybe Christmas has just not felt like it had that magic. You let it be the signpost to what you truly desire. Or maybe it's looking at the church's rituals. You know, what I love is that as we journey this into the New Testament, we find Paul saying these outrageous things at times. In Galatians, he makes these claims that there's now no longer Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. And everyone would look around at them and be like, yeah, there is. And it actually makes a big difference. Like, if I'm a woman, like, I can't do much in the Roman Empire. And it's great that you said that, Paul, but it's not helping me in my day-to-day. Or he says that you have been raised to life with Christ, or that you are a new creation. It's like, that sounds great, but I'm not experiencing that in my day-to-day. But what was Easter but an opportunity to glimpse at that reality, that in Christ that is a new world, that we are a new creation and we have been raised to life? What is it when they would gather together for those times of prayer where all were equal, but to glimpse for a moment that maybe, just maybe, there is a world to come in which there is no divisions between us? Maybe it's taking a look at those Christian holidays that we celebrate, of Easter, of Christmas, of so many more. You can kind of take on the liturgical calendar if you wish, but to have that glimpse that maybe, just maybe, the things that are promised are to come, and that we can train our hopes to see what God is doing in the future. We can take those rituals to reorient how we live in the present and to remember what God has done in the past. And as we remember what God has done in the past, each week here at Key City, we embark on one of the great rituals of the church, something that the church has been doing for 2,000 years, a remembrance of what has happened, of Christ's death on the cross for us. And as we looked at that festival of Passover, the one that started the Jewish year, it became later the Lord's Supper, as Jesus, the night before he was going to go to the cross, took that time to redesign the ritual so that the default of going through the motions each week at church would be something that connected us back to what he had done, to who he is, showing us that he is for us. And so on that night before Jesus was going to the cross, he said, I know we have this Passover ritual, but we're going to change it. We're going to change it to bring our attention to what I'm about to do in giving my life. We're going to change our intention to remembering that we are a people that God deemed worthy of dying for. And we're going to repeat it, because it is through those rituals that we get to glimpse just for a moment the hope of life in Christ, that we get to experience the poetry of religion, as Jacob Milgram put it. And so as Thomas and Christy come forward, they're going to give the elements of communion, which are the bread and grape juice for us to remember Christ's body and blood. So they're going to come around and do that shortly, and then we'll take it together.